Thank you, Philip. It's a real pleasure to be here. I guess it was 2007 the last time I was here, and so it's really good to reconnect after a bit of a hiatus. And I also want to thank all of you for coming out in this weather. At least it's not raining sideways, which is half of my recollection from years of being here before. So, we caught a break, and at least your umbrella might catch it. So this is part of a joint project directed out of the Stanford Center for Poverty and Inequality by David Grusky, and a group of us have broken down the economy society complex into different parts, and my charge was to keep an eye on the labor market. And so this is the third update of a thing that started with a Russell Sage edited volume by David and Bruce Western, and now we're adding new data as some countries. Well, this is the first time we've looked at countries. We've been focused on the U.S., looking at first group differences and then state-to-state variation. And now this time we're bringing in the Luxembourg income study data and OECD data to look at cross-national variation. But as much as anything, I'm here hoping to get some suggestions, because as you'll see as I go along, there's lots of descriptive results, but not a lot of explanatory leverage. Each of the usual suspects ends up being acquitted as I go through the analysis. So just by way of summary, in case anybody's got to go, I like to start at the end and then build back toward it. Oh yeah, and I should mention this is a modification of a talk I gave at Stanford, so there's a bit of a U.S. slant to it. And the key findings are that the countries that had the greatest employment drop during the recession, that started at various times in December of 2007 in the U.S., later in other countries, brought on by the financial crisis really of 2008. The countries that had the biggest decline from 2005 to 2010 were number one, Ireland, number two, Hungary, Greece, Spain, Iceland, and then the USA. And that's what we're measuring employment here, not in perhaps the same way that it usually is, but focusing on prime age employment, looking at people who are 25 to 54 years old. Now, you get a pretty similar pattern on overall employment, but focused in on the 25 to 54-year-old group. And only 84% of American men and 70% of American women were employed in the most recent data at the time I made these slides, which was December of 2015. There's been a slight uptick in January, and we're anticipating a slight uptick again in February. But these are rough estimates, and these are very low numbers for U.S. men historically, and a long-running 15-year stagnation among American women, and neither of those numbers are as high as they were before the recession. And so I'm going to focus in on U.S., Ireland, and U.K. in a lot of the comparisons today, but I've got data on, as it says here, 22 countries. And you can see, just to interpret this, we'll get back to a bigger version of this slide, but I'm ranking the countries by employment at the bottom of the recession, more or less. And at that point, men's employment at the bottom of the recession. At that point, Germany had the highest men's employment, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, etc. Cruising on down here, we see the UK. Then we get to the US, Estonia, Spain, Greece, Hungary, and Ireland. And Ireland had gone from about 83% employment for men, and it fell below 70% at the bottom of the recession. Irish women went from 65% back down to 60% over that period. through the recession. And in many countries, there's an increase in employment for women. Poland in particular, Luxembourg, Italy, Germany, etc. And so this decrease for Irish women stands out even more, despite the fact that it's small relative to the decrease for men. It's still a significant increase in a context in which many countries actually saw increases in women's employment during this time. Okay, I guess I have to point at this thing again. Taking a slightly longer view in the U.S., going back to 1990, we can see that there have been 3 recessions. These are the last 3 recessions in the U.S. In 1991, actually men's employment started down before the recession took off. These are the recession months here. And these are monthly data smoothed. And you see that the decline started before the recession and continued afterwards. Recovered a bit, but didn't get back up to the level pre-recession. For 2001, again, predate and postdate the recession. Got back up to got about halfway back up to the pre-recession levels when the Great Recession took place, and this is the biggest decline in men's employment in the U.S. since 1930. So it's just an amazing depth of change, and we're about halfway back on men's employment. Among the women, again, similar to the men, after the 2001 recession, they got partway back, and then the Great Recession took them down again. And the women are about 2/3 of the way back to pre-recession levels. Oh yeah, I don't have to touch the keyboard. Here we go. Men's employment has actually not recovered from a recession since the 1970s. American men's recession, this one isn't smooth, so you see the jaggedness of the monthly data. I've drawn lines here that go out either 5 years or to the beginning of the next recession following a recession. And you see the anticipated drop-off in men's employment during the recession, but then the recovery doesn't come back up before another recession starts, and so on. Now, through the 1960s, this timeline, you might not be able to see it. This is 1947 onward, so basically the whole post-war era. There were many times, a couple of times in the post-war era when men's employment did recover. And indeed, its peak levels were in 1956 and again in 1968. But since the 70s, American men of prime working age have never recovered from a recession. And it's a pretty amazing historical trend in which men's employment is just driven down by each recession. It doesn't quite get back up to the pre-recession levels. So going back to the cross-national data, in a little bigger, and I can make it even bigger than that. It's worth noting, I've already pointed at the Irish data, the famous cases of Greece and Hungary. Actually, Greek and Hungarian men were working at slightly higher rates than Irish men in 2010. And U.S. men, the dots overlap here, so it's a little weird. But the U.S. men also saw quite a big decline. And several of these countries, Poland and Germany in particular, saw actual increases in employment during the recession. In part because they had particular national recessions in 2004 or 5 that they were recovering from between 2005 and 2010, whereas most of the other countries were just entering recession after periods, nobody bigger than here, periods of boom times. Let's zoom in on this. These are some annual data, and to get that, I had to get beyond the list and take a look at OECD data, and they don't always perfectly align. The list tells a somewhat different story than the OECD about Irish employment over these years, and I don't have any idea why. Nor does Janet Gornick. She actually said she lost sleep once she saw this figure because she thought they should be perfectly aligned as they are here, say for the Greek women, or here for the Canadians. But somehow in Ireland and Germany in particular, there's a big gap between OECD and list data. But if we look in on these OECD data, we see the Irish employment levels approaching 90% for men and about 65% for women. And then the recession hits, and there is substantial drop. One other thing to point out about the Irish case, though, that unlike most other countries that experienced this big drop, there is sign of recovery after 2011 in the Irish data. Not so in Greece and Spain, and we'll get to Italy in a minute, and it's also, we won't see any sign of increase there either. The scale gets a little distorted because, you know, what was going on in Spain was kind of stasis for Spanish men, but tremendous flow of Spanish women into the labor market. You know, Iceland has their own financial crisis. We've got very little data on Icelandic employment, but it appears to be very high. In this international context, those roller coasters of American data are somewhat moderate relative to, say, this historic rise of Spanish women's employment. What other country do I want to point out? Oh, yeah, despite the double dip recession, there's no change in British employment, in UK employment over this period. You know, a percentage point drop for the men, and quote unquote full recovery. I mean, you know, it wasn't much of a trauma to begin with. And the French, not much change there either. Women's goes up and, you know, plateaus, but there's not nearly the kind of dramatic employment impacts in those countries as we saw in both Ireland and the United States. And then we get down here to Italy, where women's increases. The only reason the Italians don't get into the top 5 in terms of employment laws, they would on the men, but the women's gains here in those at first from for the first couple of years of the period covered offset the change for the men, and so the overall change is smaller for Italy. And the other one to note, here's this, you know, the dip in Germany comes early and then the recovery. And so Germany doesn't make the list either. In fact, Germany is more like France and Britain, more or less steady. And Poland has real growth after 2005. This is a tremendous amount of variation. Every country seems to be on their own path, and they are and they don't align very well with normal notions. Well, by now normal notions of welfare state type of organization and virtually any other kind of macro explanatory factor that I can come up with. Why it's the U.S. and Ireland that show recovery, big drops and then big recovery. Comparable economies to the U.S. economy, like the British, shows no employment change, despite a big dip in GDP. And so it's very hard to try and explain these rather bold international differences in the pattern and patterning of employment. And if people have suggestions or variables to be looked at, I appreciate the comments. I do want to point out at this point too that there's work going on here at Geary that Chris Whelan sent me last week that shows very much the same kind of, not perfectly aligned, but the same hard to explain sets of patterns where some countries are experiencing big drops in disposable income, and other countries they aren't, and it's not perfectly aligned with the usual sense of welfare state, and it's certainly not explained by variation in the intensity or gravity of the GDP loss to the recession. Although Ireland does fit what you'd expect in that Irish disposable income drops pretty much proportional to GDP. In all the other countries that you'd expect that kind of decline, you don't see it, and in a couple countries where you wouldn't expect to see it, it occurs nonetheless. So these are hard to explain patterns, and I'm not here to offer you an explanation. I'm here to offer you grist for the mill. So here are some data that that address those issues of GDP. If GDP was the prime explanatory factor, what we would see in all these countries is that the dip in GDP and employment would be proportional or commensurate. But in fact, we see that the data for the U.S. and Germany look very similar. It's U.S. and Canada that look very similar. But Canada has nothing approaching the U.S. pattern of employment loss. They don't lose nearly as many jobs as the Americans do. Germany does have the increasing through this period, and you can see it in the GDP. They were on a march to recovery. They had a dip there, and then steady upward growth. So Germany accords pretty well with what would be expected. But and here we see in the UK data, we see the double dip that hits them. Maybe not. I guess it doesn't show up here. I'm surprised by that. Anyway, when I make a correlation between GDP change and employment change, the correlation is 0.2. And so it's statistically notable, but it doesn't account for what's going on. There's also an interesting pattern having to do with GDP per hours worked. If employment was completely driven by GDP, and this is probably a clearer way to look at this than over here. Every place would look like more or less like France or the UK, where in which there is virtually no change in GDP per hour worked. So people lose, national income goes down, employment goes down. The U.S. in a lot of ways overcorrects. So the GDP per hour worked actually goes up in both the U.S. and Germany during the recession, which means that they're laying off, one might say, less productive workers, but really what's going on is they're somehow maintaining the economic engine while disposing of employment and losing jobs. And so in that interpretation, it's a bit of an overcorrection. There's too much job loss in the U.S. relative to GDP change, and too much job loss in Germany as well, which is an odd thing since well anyway. Whereas if GDP was the whole story, every place would look like the UK, and virtually no place looks like the UK. So I shifted, and this isn't in the written part. This is actually partly borrowed from the work of Janet Gornick, and partly original work that I've done since the February 1st meeting at Stanford, and that is to switch indicators. And I'll also point out that Chris's work has been multi-indicator. Take more than one look at how the economy and the employment situation are going. And so we look here to the, first of all, let's just look at before tax and transfer poverty in these countries. And what we see here is that the market is generating substantial poverty across countries. The scale here, we start at 20%, even Iceland is above 20%. US, Australia, Norway, Denmark, all these countries have market level poverty of about 30%. And this is using the usual list definition. If you haven't seen it before, it's half of median income. And so what proportion of the population is below half of median income in that country? And the answer is, about 22% for Iceland, 29% for Australia, 30+% for US, Netherlands, etc. And then we get up here to Ireland, and it's about 42 or 3%. And we get to Hungary, where it's two-thirds of, and so Hungary is this polarized income distribution, where some people are really doing extremely well, and the vast majority are below half of the median income. Now, I've made an unusual switch here and moved the graph we were looking at to the right, because just to remind me to tell you that the scale now has shifted tremendously. So the scale over here ran from 20 to 70%. Here the scale runs from 0 to 20%. And so taxes and transfers are, on the one hand, everywhere, reducing poverty. So that's what they're designed to do, and they're working to varying degrees, because it's not a simple. I haven't changed the rank order at all here, so we lose that rank order when we shift to post-transfer. Hungary is spending a lot of its political effort and state capacity to redistribute incomes so that the disposable incomes for the Hungarians are leave about 7 or 8% of the population in poverty. 7 or 8% of the population below the median income. So that's a really dramatic and important redistribution. Ireland does less, so we find, but still it's a very significant amount. And about the only country the country that moves the least is the United States. Moves from a relatively low status to actually the highest poverty rate among this list of well-off nations, which is pretty much the same. So on net, almost 17% of Americans are below half the median income, and that's the highest number among these nations, even higher than, say, Spain or Greece. And so, then thinking back on this, which countries are better off and which countries are worse off after the crash, I'd say that one of the things that happens for Ireland is that the crash was very expensive for the state, in the sense that to offset the poverty that was generated by the recession, it had to use a lot of state resources in order to get back down to from 30%, 33% down to 9% poverty.
Sorry, is there a date?
Oh, these data are all from 2010. So sort of the bottom of the recession. Yeah. The U.S. was doing some of it, but not nearly enough. And it's in part because most of the action for the U.S. is not direct transfers, but is rather a tax credit that families get, conditional on having a job. So for those who were thrown out of work, they no longer got the earned income tax credit. You had to have employment income in order to have the earned income tax credit, and by lacking that, the efficiency or the effectiveness of the offset was it was just ineffective. It cuts the poverty rate in half, but that still leaves the U.S. at the top of these ranks. Then we can look at another way of looking at it is how much redistribution, or how effectively are countries redistributing. There's no hope of making any sense of that, so let's zoom up. So what the little gray line, the dashed gray line, is showing is the average for all of these countries before and after taxes. So we're looking at before and after tax and transfer. On average, the poverty rate before is about a third, and the poverty rate after is about 10% or 9%. Australia starts out below, but redistributes less. The U.S. starts out low, but redistributes less. The UK pretty much performs right at the average. UK is an average country out of this set. Ireland actually redistributes more than average. You see that the rate is reduced, the poverty rate is reduced more in Ireland than on average. The Netherlands is another kind of average country. Like the UK, it is reducing poverty by an average amount, but it starts low and ends up low. Only a percentage point, but it's nonetheless, you know, the actual line is below the average line. Oh, I thought I had. Oh darn! I somehow cut out Greece. I wanted to show you staying in Greece, but we'll have to go back to the hard to see one. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Greece is the same as the UK. Now it starts, you know, and so relative to the employment circumstances and the GDP circumstances and the national debt of Greece, they're actually quite close to the UK on all of these indicators. Where they stand out is on their debt. And so in part, they are achieving this result with borrowed money. They can't generate enough in-house, and so their debt runs up. And it's 2011 when they get in their most serious political trouble because of that. And so, but in part, this redistribution is achieved sort of off the usual model by borrowing in order to meet this obligation. And it's then why austerity, the pushback against austerity is so great. Because they can't achieve this offset. So if I had 2014 data, we don't. Because among other things, you have to pay to collect data. And without, you know, in periods of austerity, a lot of countries drop data collection. So is there a formula in here for getting employment going again? Not really. You know, for the U.S., the European lesson is completely opaque. There was no way to figure out from the European data what lesson the U.S. ought to learn. I didn't bring it up here, but I've got a few minutes I'll walk through. In last year's report, I talked about not distributed total, but you can get it on the Stanford website. I compared the 1980s Reagan recession with the Great Recession and the recovery from it. And the question was, how did the U.S. get out of that 1982-83 double-dip recession that, on the one hand, produced a positive outcome of getting rid of hyperinflation. The U.S. had crazy stagflation, high unemployment, more than 10% unemployment, and double-digit inflation. And you know, this didn't fit anybody's economic model. And basically, the Federal Reserve was able, through the manipulation of interest rates, to get interest rates back down to about 4% from 16-17%. I once had a 22% credit card and a 16% house mortgage. I managed to get out of those very quickly, but nonetheless, it was just a crazy time. So how did that generate jobs, or how did they create jobs after that? The first thing that happened was a housing boom occurred in the U.S. 1985 to 1987, a building boom, which put a lot of carpenters and others in building trades and the manufacturers who were making building materials, increased employment in all those industries. And the stimulus for that was, on the one hand, the falling interest rates, and on the other, deregulation of the savings and loan industry. And there had been, for 30 years, clamoring to let savings and loans, like building societies here, act like banks. And in 1983, the regulations were lifted and they were allowed to act like banks. They then started to compete with banks and over-competed, cut their interest rates more than the banks did, generated a housing bubble, and lost their businesses. By 1987, 60% of the savings and loans had either been taken over by regular banks or gone out of business. So the sector just basically went on a spree, blew up the economy, puffed up the economy, and then there was a 1987 little housing crash. And it sort of anticipated what we saw here in Ireland in 2010. And at a smaller scale, but a lesson we might have wanted to have learned. And so, but that got the economy going again. Two other innovations stimulated manufacturing. Personal computers came on the market and proved to be popular not only with businesses, but with individuals in their homes. And so they've been around since 1981, but they became a popular consumer item in 1984 and 1985. And the sale of those generated, back then, they were all made in the US because the engineers were still inventing them. And so you had to have your manufacturing plant right next door to the workshop where people were doing the engineering, because there could be modifications during the course of a business day even in the specs for one of the chips or what have you. And so almost all of them were made in the US. And that certainly helped employment. And the minivan was invented. The minivan, first of all, the government bailed out Chrysler. Chrysler then invested in this concept of let's build hippie vans for former hippie parents, and this was their concept. These kids used to ride around in Volkswagen vans painted with day-glow paint and no seats. Let's give them some comforts and make them really easy to put a car seat in. And they proved enormously. The Plymouth Voyager, etc., proved to be extremely popular, and then were instantly copied by all the other car companies. But that first mover, Chrysler had a huge first mover advantage in that whole market, and it stimulated employment and was far more sustainable. So where is the new personal computer or the new minivan? For a while, people were sitting around waiting for some kind of biotechnology, some bionic heart or some kind of something or other that people could make and employ people in making. Instead, what we got were Apple Watches, which employ virtually nobody, but do sell a lot. But they don't employ anybody in the U.S. In the making of them. And so these inventions are not employment machines on the order of those two big innovations in the 1980s. So anyway, we used to talk in the 1980s, at least on the U.S. side of the Atlantic, about Eurosclerosis. The notion that European labor markets weren't flexible enough. It was too costly to hire and fire workers, and so the economy couldn't adapt during times of change. And one way of understanding the stasis in France and Britain might be that, but from these data, that doesn't look like a bad thing. Employment was both higher before and during the recession in Britain and France than in flexible, fast-moving American, both U.S. and Canada. And so I think that old model of you got to keep the workers at risk in order to keep the economy strong has a big hole in it. There has been across Europe somewhat less GDP growth than in the United States, but the tremendous inequality in the U.S. distribution of incomes has meant that as during the good times, the top 1% and the top 10% are gobbling up almost all of the growth post 2010, and there has been very little growth beyond the 90th percentile of the income distribution. More importantly, total stagnation of wages in the U.S. and in Tim Smeating's paper in the Stanford volume, similar stagnation across Europe. So wages aren't rising anywhere. Is that a globalization effect? Is that a policy effect? Is that just the nature of market economics? We can't say. Since income inequality is growing everywhere, just it hasn't reached the peak it has in the United States in most places. But this long-term wage stagnation is, I think, the next frontier that I'm personally going to start pursuing and get serious about it. All I can do is talk about the Smeating's paper. I can't present you with my own evidence here, but I think it has, there's part of the story there. The political campaign of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the United States is feeding off of that. They're offering radically different solutions to far right and far left solutions to the problem, but they're both tapping growing concern among Americans in the growth, in the lack of growth in wages, and when coupled with the employment trends that I've documented here, I think that it's signs of weakness and problems for the American economy going forward that are masked by focus on GDP numbers that look so. There they are. The usual indicator, the first indicator people go to is this GDP per capita. I'd say that tells us next to nothing about how well the economy is doing. It might tell us how the well-off are doing. It's famously subject to problems of change in the age distribution, but there's way more going on than that. There are distributional issues. We can't see from these numbers. There's virtually no correlation between those numbers and the numbers on employment. And so we need better and more sensitive indicators. And I really like. This is one of the things I like the most about Chris's paper was that it develops much more sensitive indicators for the performance of the economy than the old workhorse. I'd even offer this as a positive alternative. These are my own calculations, and I'm not aware of big data sets that have made use of GDP per hour. But I think it's a better indicator, at least of the way in which employment is tied to overall economic production. Okay, I think that might be the points I have to make. Yeah.